Thank you all. Welcome to the Q&A Cafe here at the Georgetown Club in Georgetown, and with our guest Sally Bedell Smith, who I'm thrilled to welcome back for a second, possibly even a third appearance.
Maybe even a third.
Yes,
yeah,
I know, but it's wonderful to have her back with us. And I always like to give our interviews a timestamp because they're on cable and YouTube and social media forever. And I don't know quite how to put it, but right now while we're sitting here, Stormy Daniels is testifying at the Trump hush money trial. And so thank you all for tearing yourselves away from cable TV and whatnot to talk about another exciting family over across the pond, the royal family.
But and Harry just landed in London today.
Well, so there's going to be more headlines. I don't know if you or anybody in the room follows astrology. I don't seriously follow it. But I was reading something yesterday that may explain everything that's going on in our world right now. Mercury is in retrograde.
Always a bad time.
Apparently that explains everything. Whether you're Donald Trump or King Charles or yourselves, you know, it's like there's a lot of.
You want to get out of that.
And it's not going to happen right away. Yeah. So we all just have to fasten our seatbelts and get through Mercury in retrograde. Spring is a huge time for the royal family, I've realized. Yeah. I think we just had the anniversary yesterday.
The first anniversary of the coronation.
Of the coronation.
Which nobody typically celebrates in any way. But everybody, everybody marked it. There were,
Well, given how long he waited for the job.
Yeah. It's worth remarking.
It's worth remarking. Was it Charlotte's birthday, or I know it was Archie's birthday?
Yes, Archie's birthday was yesterday. Charlotte's was last week, and Louis was a few weeks earlier. And in the case of both Louis and Charlotte, they released their photos to social media, and the Buckingham Palace officials made certain to say that neither of the photos was edited. Going back to the terrible edit gate, which was sad, but
notorious.
On Mother's Day, Mothering Sunday, she released that photo, and she tweaked a few things, and everybody went nuts.
I believe also with the most recent photos that she took them.
Yes, she did.
So, and which is a positive sign.
Yeah.
We have Trooping of the Colors coming up, the D-Day anniversary.
Right.
There's just a lot in the spring.
This is the season.
So I want to start with the worst of it, and then we'll get to the best of it. The worst of it, of course, is that King Charles and Kate Middleton both have cancer.
Let's call her the Duchess. Let's call her the Princess of Wales.
I'm going to let you guide me.
Okay.
Because
she left Kate Middleton back in 2011,
I know,
and I think. I don't know, for whatever reason,
a
lot of people still call her Kate Middleton.
I once worked for Larry King, who always called Princess Diana Lady Di, so.
There you go. Same thing.
So anyway, they both have cancer, and I just learned yesterday in doing research for this that King Charles is not in remission, that he's still being treated, and that it is a little bit, I don't know the degree of risk, but for him to go and ride on a horse with a big hat on his head and do a lot of other strenuous, forward-facing appearances, as they call them. So I want to ask you, how concerned are they about his health?
Well, I was over there for a month, and I asked a lot of people that question. And the day before I left, I had tea with somebody who knows him very well and is on the phone with him a lot. And he said, if there was something really gravely wrong, I would know about it. But he was quite optimistic. And this was like a week before Buckingham Palace announced that he would once again be doing public-facing duties, the first of which he did last week. And he is committing himself to a number of engagements over the summer, but in a more limited way, on the advice of his doctors. He gave a sort of a preview of that on Easter when he surprised everybody after the service by going down a line. Somebody counted them shaking 95 hands without gloves. Obviously, he doesn't wear gloves like his mother did, but
when you're immunocompromised,
yeah,
a phrase we've all
he
come
did
to
that.
learn.
And my sense, and he's doing a Buckingham Palace garden party this week. You know, he's doing things that that he has the energy to do, and he has a lot of energy. Camilla was quoted the other day as saying, "I'm trying to restrain him," because he was sort of
Overdoing it.
well, I mean, that's his default, is to overdo. There was a wonderful moment when I was in Sri Lanka back in 2013 when he represented his mother for the first time at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And on the very last day, I was working on my book about him. On the very last day, he and Camilla were taking a tour of this lovely little town of Medina. And he met a woman there whom he had previously met back in the 1960s, and she ran a shop. Obviously, they had, found her. And she came up to him and she said, "I'm 91 years old." And he said, "Well, I just turned 65. And she said, "And I'm still working." And he said, "Keep going. Don't ever stop." And that was the end. He gave me the end of my biography of him. But he is driven, and he always has been. He's been on a mission. He's been on a mission to save the world in whatever way he can. And that began in 1970.
What do you think was behind the reporting of last week that he was at death's doorstep? Is that is that something devious from within the palace?
No, I don't think it's from the palace at all. I mean, I heard that from people when I was over there saying, shaking their heads, this is the end. But my sense, obviously he's still receiving, as you say, receiving treatments. But, he has not revealed what kind of cancer he has, except to say it is not prostate. But he had a very minimally invasive procedure on his prostate. And then he began chemo. I mean, the sort of most logical, and I've heard this from doctors as well as laymen, as well as people who are in touch with him who don't really know, but he may have bladder, cancer of the bladder, which is eminently treatable. And people can go on for years. So to me, that's the best case scenario for him.
Do you think they should have been more candid?
I think it would have, I think probably, particularly in his case, because he is the head of state, and his having a disease that could lay him up for periods of time has consequences.
Right.
I mean, but I think they've handled what they said he had cancer. They have taken the opportunity to promote cancer awareness, early detection, doing treatment. He became a patron of a cancer organization. His very first engagement was to the Macmillan Cancer Center. And he, in a way that struck a lot of people as unusual. He's a people person. He loves mingling with people. I have pictures of him when he was 40 years old, dancing with all these women who had been involved with his Princess Trust. He feeds on that. It gives him energy. And there he was, talking to people in this cancer center who were on infusion machines. They were being infused while they were talking to him. And he was asking very specific questions about their treatments, about how they were responding. He talked to one man and he said, "Are you using a cool cap?" Which I'd never heard of, but apparently it's something that you can put on and it prevents hair loss or mitigates it.
I'm sure he has. I'm sure he's got all
his
the
very
latest
own cool
everything
cap. Maybe even has
available.
a few jewels in it. I don't know.
I remember in our own, the lives of our public officials, how significant it was when Betty Ford, for example, came public with breast cancer and even alcoholism.
Yes.
And it became more about the disease or condition than the hiding it or not being candid about it.
I mean, I have a feeling that he will eventually say what it is. And what it does when you specify it is it eliminates all the speculation and the worst case scenarios and the best case scenarios and all the things that fly around on social media. I think he sort of counteracted that by very, very cleverly from the very beginning issuing photos of him, meeting with Rishi Sunak, taking the credentials of ambassadors, meeting veterans of the Korean War, showing that behind the palace walls he was doing his work.
Do you think that Kensington Palace, isn't that where the Prince and Princess of Wales reside,
I mean, I think
are handling their situation much differently?
They have been. And I mean, I think it has to do, based on, again, what people were saying to me when I was over there. She had really major surgery. And from the beginning, they said it was going to take 2 weeks in the hospital. I mean, I don't know how, I haven't, thank God, been in this position, but we know a lot of people who go into the hospital for surgery, and usually they kick you out after a few days. But
for most of the surgeries that come to mind,
but 2 weeks is a long time. And then, obviously, she's now been out of action for nearly 4 months.
Yeah.
We know now because after the social media trolls were really ripping her apart, she did that video, which was very brave, I thought, and it immediately broke the fever.
Yeah.
Everybody realized that she was going through something awful, and they pulled back. Now, whether that'll bubble up again, as you said, it was starting to bubble up again last week, and I don't know how they're going to handle it. And it's, I mean, I have to say, there's a difference too. Charles has, and his friends, he's quite open with them. I mean, when I was over there, I talked to somebody who'd had lunch with him the week before, and Kate and William are much, much tighter, much more secretive about.
And I think her mother is who she sees.
Yeah, and she has her own family that is very protective of her. And when they, for example, for spring break, for Easter break, they went up to Norfolk to their house there on the Sandringham estate, and Anmer, and they were there for 3 weeks. And I talked to a couple of my friends who live nearby, and they said, we leave them alone. They do their thing. They go and the boys, jump off the boats that they keep in a little harbor. They have a, I've seen it. They have a really adorable beach house at Brancaster Beach. And they, that's what the people who live up there are accustomed to, seeing them in a very informal way and never telling anybody. So they're able, and they have a tight circle of friends.
But do you know what the diagnosis is, and out of discretion, you don't share?
I do not. And I tried. I talked to people close to them. Believe me, I tried.
If you did know, do you think you'd report it?
I might not. And there are sort of two theories of the case. One, that she may have had some sort of gynecological issues, ended up having a hysterectomy and, maybe everything else. The other, more sort of trouble, and while in the process, they maybe thought she had growths of some sort, and they biopsied them and realized they were cancer.
Yeah.
Or the other is that she had some sort of abdominal, some sort of intestinal condition, and again, they went in, saw what they were looking for. Maybe, I'm guessing, maybe they did a resection and took something out. I think that's a pretty educated guess. And then, figured out that it hadn't metastasized.
Which is good.
And that's why she said preventive chemotherapy. But that's a theory that, again, doctors and people who know them think may be believable.
I'm going to step back a little bit because and talk about Queen Elizabeth, who's the anniversary of her death will come up in September.
Yes.
What's filled the void? How's the royal family changed? How's the culture changed? How is the monarchy without her?
Well, I think obviously there's a great gaping hole, and people are probably still on some level grieving her. But I think what has been remarkable is how, everybody was worried what's going to happen when you have to replace this icon who we've known for 70 years. Mm-hmm. And, but he really did not put a foot wrong. He gave that wonderful speech after her death, and he said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to serve. There are a lot of things that I did when I was Prince of Wales, all my enterprises, all my projects, and I'm not going to be able to do those the way I did before because as a constitutional monarch, I'm more limited. And he just was out there and said that. He immediately made Kate and William the Prince and Princess of Wales. He very sweetly sent his love to Harry and Meghan, despite everything they had done to him. And he just set a really good tone. He wanted to go to the climate conference in Egypt, and as Prince of Wales, he probably could have done that, but as king, the government said that's probably a little too much of being an advocate, even though that's what you've been doing practically your whole adult life. And it was, I guess, Rishi Sunak who suggested, why don't you have a big reception at Buckingham Palace for all the people who are going to Sharm el-Sheikh.
Now you get to be king.
And he sort of used his convening power basically by saying, I endorse what all these people are doing when they go out to the Middle East. And he has launched a few initiatives. He's always been concerned about food waste. And he, some weeks ago, launched an initiative to really come to grips with it. So everybody was giving him high marks. There was a poll the other day in the Mail on Sunday that said everybody in the royal family, even Andrew by 1 point,
he's bumped up?
Has bumped up a lot. William and Kate are still number 1 and number 2, and Charles is behind them, but his numbers are way up. And there was another really interesting poll, just, I think, released yesterday, that surveyed the views of young people and even children on how they regard the monarchy, sort of referring back to the coronation and what they may have learned from that. But they found evidence that young people, especially children, really admire the king for his environmental work, and that could be a bond that will help enhance his popularity among people you wouldn't have thought would necessarily have been for him.
Right. Since you're speaking of polls, why do you think Harry's in London?
Well, I know why he's in London. Tomorrow in St. Paul's Cathedral, there's a service commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Invictus Games. And I don't believe, maybe proven wrong, but I don't believe anybody in the royal family is going, or at least any senior members. Certainly William isn't, certainly the king isn't, Camilla isn't. I know somebody who worked very closely with William and Harry who is going to be there, and I'm going to try and find out.
Because they may not see each other publicly, but possibly they could see each other privately.
This is a very, very busy time of year for the king, even in a limited way. He's presiding over his first garden party of the season, which will have like 8,000 people. And he's doing other things, and we'll see. He may make time for him on Thursday, but they had that famous 30-minute meeting in Clarence House, and Camilla was there.
When he was diagnosed,
When he
right?
was right
when
after
Harry
he was
flew
diagnosed,
over
he made a flying visit
and
met with
was
him in
on his way
Clarence
back
House.
almost as fast.
Yeah.
Yeah. But still, they saw each other.
They saw each other, and I gather Camilla was in the room too.
Who's the family intermediary for Harry and
Well,
Charles?
you know, the thinking was that it would be Kate. I mean, there was that moment, I think, after Prince Philip's funeral, when she sort of maneuvered her way out of the way so William and Harry would be able to talk. And then it turns out, we find out from Harry's book, that they had sort of cross words. But I think she was in a position, even though she felt, she felt very aggrieved at the way Meghan had talked about her and the way Harry had.
It's fair to
as
say
well.
you're not a fan of Meghan Markle.
I am not. No. I mean, because I know from having interviewed a lot of people, I know that they really, really wanted it to work. And I was in Windsor in 2018 covering the wedding for CNN, and the world was in love with Meghan. And the royal family really, really liked her. And the Queen went out of her way to give patronages and to give roles to both her and Harry. The Queen's, one of her big legacies was the Commonwealth, which is now 56 nations around the world, started by her father. And now Charles is the head of the Commonwealth. And she gave Harry and Meghan two pretty important jobs where they could travel around the world, have a fantastic platform, and represent her, and also do whatever initiatives they wanted to do. I mean, she gave Meghan in particular a lot of latitude in terms of what she could do in addition to representing the Queen. And, they just kind of turned their backs on that.
But how much, I mean, I don't know that much about Meghan Markle. I'm probably typical in that I remember the wedding, how wonderful I thought it was. I'm of the Princess Diana era, so I still think of Harry and William as little boys, and I want them to be forever happy. And then I noticed the very harsh, abrasive racism in the British tabloids.
Yeah.
And then this turn. And I wondered to what degree, what were the components of the break for Meghan with wanting to do this great job that she'd been offered by the Queen?
Yeah. I hate to say this, but I think a lot of it had to do with money. Harry inherited 15 million pounds from his mother. It was managed very well. By the time he married Meghan, it was up to 30 million. He had a very generous allowance from the Prince of Wales of something like 3 or 4 million pounds a year. They had Nottingham Cottage, which was admittedly tiny, and she hated it. And then they got Frogmore Cottage at Windsor, and they did a big renovation. And, it's a very nice place to live.
Frogmore's legendary.
Yeah. And I mean, that is what I picked up from people. And I mean, I was shocked actually in the fall of 2018 when I had dinner with several people who had worked for Harry and Meghan. And they were pulling their hair out because she had her own agenda. And look, I mean, the Queen gave her things like the patronage of the National Theatre, which, given her background, was a very thoughtful thing to do, and other things. But she wanted more. And I do get the sense that once she had married him, that she really wanted to get back to the United States, and she, didn't really want to do the nuts and bolts of being in the royal family and the things that, are, as Queen Mary used to say, tiresome. But
it's a job.
It's a job. It is a job. And it's, a lot of it is boring. You have to sit next to some, mayor of some small city, and the Lord Lieutenant, and you have to make conversation with him. And I watched the Queen on a number of these occasions, sitting next to a crossing guard, or but she gave it her best because she
But she
knew.
was raised to do it.
Yeah, and she knew that it may have been, to her, one of thousands of people she met over the course of millions, maybe hundreds of thousands she met over the course of her reign. But for this little crossing guard, and it was a moment she'll remember forever. And they were very aware of that. I remember when the Queen and Prince Philip went to Australia, and Prince Philip wrote a letter to then the Queen Mother and said, we're just overwhelmed. There are a million people showed up in Sydney. I mean, it's almost too much to bear. And she said, just remember, you are the vehicle through which the people express their love for their country. And in other words, it's not about you.
It's not the other way around.
It's about what you represent and how,
Now, Diana, interestingly, grew up more, you might say, more trained for the role, and yet she too chafed at a lot of the more tedious parts of it.
She did all that willingly.
And in Harry's book, it seems almost that he was vulnerable. That he was vulnerable to a temptation to go in another direction. That he had been searching for a long time.
Yeah. No, I think that, look, when he was in the Army for 10 years, that gave him purpose.
It did, yeah.
It gave him structure. It allowed him to mingle with the lads. William had the same kind of experience when he was a pilot, and particularly when he was working for the air ambulance service in Norfolk for a couple of years. He was just one of the guys. And I think, even the Queen, when at the end of World War II, when for about a month she took, people know, she took what they call ATS training. She learned how to drive a 2-ton truck. She learned how to take apart an engine. She knew what a carburetor was. And she worked with women who were just sort of regular women, some of whom were her officers, and she had to salute them. And she always said that this was one of the best experiences she had in her life. And if you go back to George VI and Elizabeth, he was a proponent of putting the leaders of industry together with workers to help improve the lot of workers. And this was in the 20s and 30s. And he did some very specific things. And I have pictures of him coming out of a coal mine covered in coal dust.
Yeah.
And
that's what made him an inspiration for Elizabeth.
It did, and this was before he ever thought he was going to be king.
Yeah,
and they called him the Industrial Prince, and his brothers, including his older brother, mocked him for being the foreman. But this was an important experience of democratizing, and it really was crucial when he went out during World War II, and he would spend 5 hours at Coventry after it had been utterly flattened, and he was, the whole time he was sort of bearing witness to the destruction and meeting the victims and consoling them, and they did that over and over and over again in the most benighted areas of London and other cities around the country.
His level of determination is proved also in a couple of interesting details from the book. I want to talk about your research process, but the fact that I never knew this, that he proposed, was it twice? She rejected him three she
times.
rejected him twice, and she accepted on the third. That's determination, especially when you're a royal.
Yeah,
you don't want to get turned down.
He was often underestimated, I think, in part because he had that stutter that he had to, he was always mindful of it. He always had to work on it. But he had some real grit. He had suffered a lot as a child, partly from the stuttering and not being able to join in family conversations because he felt inhibited. But he learned to be a great listener, and that helped him a lot. And she, she was a happy-go-lucky aristocrat, and she had, men lining up to propose to her. There was one in particular she was in
love,
sure
right?
she was in love with, James Stewart, who was, as luck or unluck would have it, was the equerry to the then Duke of York, and that he introduced them. And Bertie fell in love with her immediately. This was in July of 1920. And he fell in love with her family, and he would invite himself for weekends. And James Stewart was always sort of lurking around the edges. And finally, a friend of Queen Mary at the end of 1921 arranged for James Stewart, who was the second son and not going to have much money, he arranged this lucrative job for him in the United States. And so off he went, and Bertie was able to make his moves. But even then, he proposed in 1921 and 1922, and they wrote these anguished letters to each other. I'm so sorry, I misled you, blah, blah, blah. And then he was about to give up, and the man who was sort of his chief advisor, Louis Grigg, was much older, put him together with a man who'd had a similar experience, being turned down repeatedly and then prevailing. And he said, you try it. And so he did in early 1920. And all this, I found out from letters and her diary that she began 2 days before he proposed to her for the third time. And it is quite extraordinary because everybody was talking about this proposal. And it went on for 12 days.
It's good it was before social media.
Oh my gosh.
Can you imagine?
But she finally said yes, like before midnight on Sunday, the 14th of January. And then it was as if a switch flipped. Their letters became really loving and, lots of X's and O's and X's
people can
and
change.
O's. Yeah.
I want to talk, that is something I want to talk about, because writing a book is one kind of pleasure, but researching it is another.
Yes.
And to read about the research you got to do on this book, that you got access to their personal archives, their letters, and I'm imagining you alone in some tower room reading these letters and these pages, but really, it's incredibly intimate. What was that like?
It is intimate.
Talk about the access you had.
This is my 8th book, and I think this is because of that. I think I got sort of more emotionally involved in this. And, I knew that to tell their story, the story of their 28-year marriage and his 15 years as king, that I had to see their diaries and letters. And so, I started a campaign to get into the Royal Archives. I had 2 really, really helpful advocates. One had
Charles and Camilla?
I wish. No, not Charles and Camilla. No, but 2 people. One had worked for the Queen for many years, who gave me lots of good advice and sort of talked to her.
I'm sure you have great sources.
And another one who knew the private secretary. And it took about 6 months of gnawing my nails. But I went there for the first time in September of 2018, and all told, I was there for 3 months, and it is a daunting place. If you see the big, fat, round tower at Windsor, the Royal Archives are at the very top, and the only way to get there is to climb this very steep staircase of
stone, I imagine.
Stone, medieval steps, with my backpack containing my computer and other things on my back. And I practically collapsed the first day. And all the archivists, they've seen this many times. They were sort of smiling, but I got really fit by the end. But it is a sort of magical place. It's a small room. It has a big table in the middle with the green leather, and then outlets, and they bring trolleys of documents to you. And there were some funny people. There were usually 4 people sitting there. One was a friend of mine named Jane Ridley, who's written a really good book about Edward VII and was working on a book about George V. So I was reading diaries, you know, George V and Queen Mary, and she was reading other years. And we were sort of trading things back and forth. She and I went on 2 field trips together. We went to White Lodge, and we went to Frogmore House. And she's fun. And after the first day, I'm a very, very fast typist. And that's the only way. You weren't allowed
you can't photograph
anything in the Royal Archives. So I was blasting away. And our literal 5-minute lunch break, you brought a sandwich and you gulped it down because you wanted to take advantage of every minute. And she looked at me and she said, I felt as if I was playing Racing Demon with you. But it was a biographer's dream to be able to see those diaries, and her diaries in particular, which she kept intermittently starting on the 1st of January 1923. They were lively and intimate. I mean, sometimes when she was upset, she did them in mirror writing, which anybody could read. It was just the words backwards. But you know,
mirror writing is
she revealed a lot, and the letters were wonderful among the family. I also was given permission to look at the archives at the again the top of a tower at Glamis, which is her family, the Strathmore family's massive castle in Scotland. And they were also very intimate, and there were a lot of his letters to her that I hadn't been able to see in the Royal Archives because they were up there. So between those 2, you know, I was able to just kind of immerse myself in their world.
I want to speak about another kind of quasi-intimate experience you had that I was fascinated by, that I don't know if it's that you worked directly with Helen Mirren, but you worked with Helen Mirren for a play in the West End, The Audience.
Yeah.
Talk about that, about why you were called in and what you were called in to do, because she had already played the Queen in the film at this time, right? So,
well, I worked with the writer and producer of The Audience, which was a wonderful play about the Queen's relationship with her prime ministers. And so Peter hired me, excuse me, as his consultant.
Peter Morgan, right?
Peter Morgan,
yeah.
right, Peter Morgan.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty happy experience. He would ask me sort of questions, would this be in character or whatever. We had one battle over a relationship with Margaret Thatcher, which he portrayed as harsher than it really was. But hey, he's the writer, he won. But we were on good terms, and when he decided to do The Crown, he asked me if I would do it again. I mean, the reason he came to me was because, you know, I had written a book about the Queen.
For obvious reasons.
Yeah, and I was working on Charles. And then I said, look, I'm immersed in this book about Charles. I don't have any time. I can't do it. And he went on and picked other people. And I think it's fortunate that I didn't go to work on The Crown, because I really started taking exception to it even in the first season, because I'm a biographer. I'm a historian. I want to get the facts right to the extent that I'm able to. And it really pains me to see somebody fictionalizing what happened to these real people. In some cases, he made up people.
But didn't it perhaps also bring people to your books?
No question. No question.
I know so many younger people who love the show, and they're like, I had no idea the royal family was interesting.
Yeah.
And I was like, you didn't grow up in my era.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, they were really interesting in the 80s and 90s. But yes, there is, you know, and look, Random House didn't hesitate to put a burst on both on the covers of both the Queen and the Prince Charles book, saying the real story behind the crown, and it was.
Them. Yeah.
And but Peter Morgan got very cross with me saying what I thought, and talking about things that were untrue, and that I worried that people were going to take it at face value. I never worried about that with the audience because it was a play and you suspend disbelief and you know that this is about the Queen and her Prime Minister and that's completely secret. Nobody's in the room, neither of them particularly talks about it. Some prime ministers have talked a little bit about it. But with The Crown, it was so beautifully written, exquisitely acted, and the production values were
amazing.
Beautiful and kind of seductive. So people thought, well, this really must have happened. So that's been a battle I've been waging. And I finally did 2 pieces for the Times of London where I was able to let it rip.
Yeah.
And did these analyses of what was true and what was false.
Oh, that can
I could
feel
have done, 10 times as much as I wrote.
How do you assess Helen Mirren's capturing of the Queen? I thought she did it really well. I mean, really well. And when she was in, what Carol was referring to, when she was in Washington playing Phaedra, I was, actually, I have to say, it was Peter Morgan who put me in touch with her because he had written The Queen, the movie that won her an Academy Award, and about what happened after Diana's death. And she came over to my apartment in Kalorama for tea, which was cool. and we had a really great conversation, and I was so struck by how insightful she was and how well she understood the Queen. Probably have to be to embody.
I mean, it was she who said, you must read the book by Marion Crawford, The Little Princesses. She said, I know the royal family hated it for reasons we still don't quite understand, but it was an admiring book, and it did have some wonderful details about the childhood. And she relied a lot on it, just to understand what she had gone through in her childhood.
I want to acknowledge here that you don't write only about the royal family. In fact, you started out doing Bill Paley, Pamela Harriman, and your first royal book was Diana. You did the Kennedys, the Clintons, and you have found a niche in the royal family. But I want to go back to that first book for a moment because Bill Paley, because you can't not be aware of what's being reported almost every day, whether Paramount, which owns CBS, what's going to happen with Paramount, what's happening with Paramount, what's happening with CBS. What do you think Bill Paley would make of the world of broadcasting and media now and news, the world of Fox News and cable and all of that? I mean,
well,
must have an insight.
I think he'd be pretty dismayed because he built CBS with Frank Stanton into this, this colossus that not only, it was high-low. They had MASH high. They had, Beverly Hillbillies low.
Profitable.
All profitable. When I was writing that book, Larry Tisch was just arriving on the scene, and cable was just beginning to make inroads. And, they were all the people at CBS were very skeptical that cable would take over in any way. So, streaming and YouTube.
We weren't even talking about streaming yet. We were just talking about cable then.
We were talking about cable.
We were talking about Ted Turner and Tisch.
Yeah. So, no, I think he would be dismayed because the CBS schedule is there, but it is.
I'm a CBS employee, and I never know whether.
I know.
We never know how to peek at Puck in the morning to see what
a peek at Puck.
Peek at Puck.
Yeah.
Take a peek at Puck.
Yeah.
And speaking of social media, you have a Substack because we only have like a minute or two left. So let's talk about your Substack so that everybody here subscribes to it.
Yes, please do.
Yeah.
It's called Royals Extra, and I started it at the behest of Random House in March of last year. And it is, the purpose is to tell people things they don't know about the royal family. There are things I wasn't able to report in my books, and I have massive archives. And it's wonderful because I can take a little more informal approach, and I feel as if I'm writing letters to people. And I've done 86 boasts, very wide-ranging, from Queen Mary's dollhouse to how the royal family has dealt with serious illness over the years, to what it was like to go to 7 very lavish parties given by the Prince of Wales back from 2008 to 2010 when I was working on my Queen book. Sort of how Burke Hall, the little hideaway that Camilla and Charles have. And I mean, it's just a very broad range of subjects.
How frequently do you update it?
I write it about once a week. Usually it comes out on the weekends. And I'm now sort of working on one. But I have maybe a little thing I'm going to add. I do these sometimes I do these midweek drop-ins, but it's all pretty much, it is all original material that people haven't seen before. And there's some things coming up that will be really, really interesting.
And do you just subscribe? Is it, you just go to it?
You say, look, you can take it for free and get there's a paywall. But if you would like to pay for it, it's a mere $60 a year, which, if you took it by the month, it would be the cost of a latte.
That's a way to look at it, or a cup of tea.
Or a cup of tea. But I think if you do, you can see the whole archives and you can see every post in full. But the internet was built on free access, so having a paywall and convincing people that it's valuable, I think it is, and I get a lot of great feedback.
Well, that's great. And everybody here is obviously a royal watcher, so they should stay in touch. I think we have your book downstairs if people want to get it and get it signed. And thank you all for coming. We'll be back in 2 weeks, I think, with some Georgetown gossip. And then our last for the season will be June 11th when we do another new book, The Wolves of K Street. So, yes, I know. Sally, it's been great to have you back.
Thank you, Carol. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.